Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. Today's episode is an archival interview, and this one's from 2016, and I'm speaking with Jay Brown from the Yoga Talks podcast. We speak about a number of topics, including the art and science of translating Sanskrit, the influence of Tantra on modern yoga, non-duality, Abhinavagupta, and how the removal of conceptual overlays and integration of transcendence reveals inherent wonder and awe in life. Hope you enjoy.
Today, I'm really happy to offer you this talk with Harish Wallace, also sometimes known as Christopher Wallace, and we do talk a little bit about that, his two names. I really think that this is perhaps one of the most, if not the most, educational of podcasts. I really took this as an opportunity for me to kind of check myself. You know, I've written about yoga philosophy over the years some, but I'm not an academic. I'm sort of like a punk rock yoga philosophy student. You know, I've done things on my own, and it's never been at like a university level or anything like that. So I had heard of Harish on Facebook. We just, we have mutual friends, and I would see some comments that he made, and we had like an exchange or two. And he's like this guy who translates Sanskrit. He's got all these crazy degrees from like Oxford and Berkeley and all these colleges, and Sanskrit and philosophy. And so, I was a little bit intimidated to speak with him, but I decided that I would really use it as an opportunity to just ask a few questions about some really fundamental things that have shaped my understanding of practice, to see if I know what the fuck I'm talking about. Forgive my language, but sometimes I just want to make sure. I think I know what I'm talking about, but it is based in my own experience and reading and coming from a place of internal authority, which some people would debate as legitimate. So in any case, I do think I managed to get to some really fundamental things with Harish. He was a very engaging guy. We did have some trouble getting together. You'll hear us talk about that some at the beginning, and we ended up doing this kind of late, not super late, but somewhat later at night than I usually do. But it didn't matter. And I think it's a really, again, engaging and informative talk. And I do hope to get him back on again, because I think I could pick his brain more. So we'll give that a listen. Before we do, just if you want to check out my stuff, the blog, the podcast, the videos, you can go to jbrownyoga.com to find that there.
All right, well, are you...
Do you go by Jay?
I do go by Jay. It's short for Jason. There's another Jason Brown who teaches yoga in New York, though. And that's
Okay.
always been the case since I lived here. And so a long time ago, he started going by Jason Ray, and I just started going by Jay because everybody called me that.
Okay, cool.
And you like to be called Harish or Christopher?
It doesn't so much matter. I don't have a strong preference. I use Harish in, yogic contexts, and Christopher in mainstream American life, I guess.
I see, and you've felt a need to separate those out.
Well, not as such. I mean, I got the name Harish when I was young, when I was 7 years old or 8 years old, from Swami Muktananda. And, you know, I always had that name whenever I would like visit his ashram in India. And so it was like, it just, since I grew up with it, it kind of, you know, I sort of grew up with a sense of like a quasi-secret inner spiritual identity, and then an outer, more public name or face or identity or something like that. I mean, I didn't think about it at the time, but there's still this residue. There's a residue of that in the sense that, like, when I'm in a yogic environment, I feel a little weird if someone calls me Christopher. And when I'm in just, you know, mainstream America, the supermarket or whatever, or in a meeting someone not from the yoga world, I would feel weird if they would call me Harish, you know?
Huh. Wow, that's wild. You know, it makes me think, you said that you got that name when you were 7.
Yeah.
And, you know, I want to give a little shout out to the Chitheads podcast that you did with Jacob Kyle, because I listened to that and I enjoyed it. And you mentioned in that podcast that you had like a mystical vision or a mystical experience at age 7. Was that before or after you got the name?
Before.
Huh.
Yeah. Yeah, that was just a spontaneous experience when I was barely 7, and then I got a name, more than a year later.
Well, I kind of feel like I'd like to call you Harish, if that's okay.
Sure.
All right. I feel like this is a yoga context. I'd like it to be.
Great.
Cool. So, you know, the other thing that I remember from that other podcast that stands out to me about you is that you also started your scholarship a little bit later in life. Like I finished college at 22, but you didn't start your scholarship until later than that.
Yeah, I finished my undergrad at 28.
Wow. See, and I really appreciated you said in that, it was like, in a way, it makes sense to me that if you do that later in life, you're much more serious about that. I know it would be different if I did it now than I did it back then, you know.
Exactly, yeah. Well,
you know, the reason I raised those 2 points from that conversation is because I feel like you're really representative of this new breed of scholar practitioner. And the first thing that I had in mind that I wanted to ask you, that I think you already maybe just answered, was, do you think of yourself as like a practitioner first and a scholar second, or a scholar first and a practitioner second, or does it not really make a difference and it's all just a mix?
It's pretty much even. In fact, it's a good question, because I've found myself spontaneously saying both scholar practitioner and practitioner scholar.
Huh.
So I think they're sort of even in my mind, and they each have sort of incredible assets that actually support the other. I mean, a lot of people in America especially have the idea that, you know, yoga is all about experience and it's not very intellectual, but in the original Indian tradition, you know, there's such a strong intellectual component to yoga that expressed as philosophy and philosophical treatises and works based on mystical experience, works based on logical argument, works based on a mixture of the two, vigorous debates amongst yogis. Not all yogis were intellectuals by any means, but it was just such a important part of the tradition to seriously and carefully think through what these experiences mean and how yoga works. And so I feel like to be a practitioner scholar is very much to be in alignment with that original tradition. And certainly the majority of, yogis weren't fluent in Sanskrit, but there was always tremendous respect paid to the seminal works of yoga philosophy. Everybody knows the Yoga Sutra, obviously, but there's many, 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 many more, most of which are untranslated, and that's why the West doesn't know them, but which were well known in their own time in India. So to me, the intellectual inquiry into the philosophy actually produces revelations that and realizations that inform and empower the practice. And the practice allows me to make sense of certain elements of the philosophy that I really feel I wouldn't understand otherwise. So that's how I see the relationship.
Well, I really appreciate that. I know for myself that once I got over just trying to accomplish asana, I knew that, in order to really feel things, I almost had to feed my intellect to some point. I was quite cynical about stuff. And so it was almost like I had to feed that part of myself so I could so it would shut up and I could just feel things. So it makes sense that both of them would want to be there. But I've never had the kind of, and I've never had the kind of scholarship that you've had. But I want to talk a little bit about that a little bit later. My other thought right now, the question that comes to mind is that when you entered your scholarship, did you know that you wanted to study Tantra, or was that something that you came to after you were already in school?
Yeah, after I was in school, I was already familiar a little bit with this branch of Tantra called Kashmir Shaivism, which at the time I didn't even know was a branch of Tantra. And I was also familiar with the Bhakti movement, the devotional movement of medieval India, and kirtan traditions and poetry, devotional poetry, and some other aspects. And I was actually of two minds originally. What did I want to study? Devotional poetry and songs, or this Kashmir Shaivism philosophy, which I knew was more sophisticated than the former, but I didn't know how much more sophisticated. And then as an undergraduate, I did a course with Paul Muller, who himself is a scholar practitioner. And that course, called Hindu Tantric Yoga, totally blew me away and opened the door to what has proved to be an endlessly delightful rabbit hole of inquiry, where this tantric tradition, so unbelievably full with profound reflections on the human condition and innovative practices and awareness cultivation techniques, the majority of which have not made it down to the present day, at least as far as the general public is concerned. Mm-hmm. So even though the mainstream teachings of Tantra, such as, everything is a manifestation of divine consciousness and we're all intimately interconnected, those, kind of general teachings have made it into the mainstream of yoga. But all the kind of specificity of tantric philosophy and of tantric yoga, practices of the energy body and awareness cultivation techniques, the majority of those have not made it into the mainstream, partially because they're so subtle. So it's been it's been like being a detective combined with a treasure hunter combined with Indiana Jones, to be able to discover this stuff, not alone, of course, with the support of incredible colleagues and teachers in the field, some practitioners and some not.
Well, I first came across you from like a Facebook post that you had where you mentioned Abhinavagupta.
Yeah.
And I only knew that name because I had taken this trip to India in 1998 and I had met this Swami there who I spent some time with. He had studied for a time at the Bihar school and then spent time with Osho, but really spent most of his time, I think, in a cave and then came down during the raining season to teach. And he kind of turned things around for me personally. And when I was leaving him, I said, who should I look to? Who should I study? And he said, Gupta, Abhinavagupta. And then when I got back to New York, it was like before the internet. I couldn't find anything on him. Yeah. I did, like he didn't even exist. I couldn't find anything about him. And I would like to talk to you about him today. But before we talked about Gupta, I want to first say that when I did get back to New York, I went to the bookstore. I remember this always. And I just wanted to see what yoga philosophy books were there. And, mostly it was just translations of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And there were several of them, and I didn't know which one to buy. So I bought several different translations. Right. And when I compared them, I was kind of shocked by how different they were.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, it just seemed to me how much interpretation from the translator is involved. And I know that you're someone who translates Sanskrit, and I read a blog that you wrote where you specifically talked about how, I've always said like a Sanskrit word can have many different English words that you put to it. And some people utilize that fact to mean that you can have whatever interpretations you want. And you were saying that you felt that no, actually, there's a context in which these teachings happen, and there's a context in which these texts happen, and that's where the correct interpretation would be. And you used the word correct. It stood out to me. And I think the only sort of, just that before I turn it over to you, the only pushback I would have is that it does seem when you're going to define the context of something or a text, that is also open to interpretation. But I guess my question is how much of translating Sanskrit is like a science and how much of it is like an art?
It's a great question, and I think is one that yogis in general don't have very much education on. First of all, there's a wide range of possibilities for specificity versus ambiguity in any given human language. Some languages lend themselves to ambiguity and some to specificity. And linguists, and you can look up any linguistic research on the subject, characterize Sanskrit as one of the more specific languages, meaning to say that it's possible to eliminate nearly all ambiguity if the author wants to. Of course, if they want ambiguity, they can have it, and they can utilize double meanings or paronomasia, which is kind of layered meaning and purposeful ambiguity. But if they want to, they can have incredible specificity, more than English, I would say. And that's why when you read Indian philosophy in Sanskrit, it is clearer. It makes more sense. It's more specific. It's less ambiguous. It's less airy-fairy. It's actually incredibly precise oftentimes. And so that's why I say the translations that we received in this culture of the West in the 50s, 60s, 70s were not full translations because they didn't convey this specificity and rigor and power of language that the Sanskrit has. They tended to be mystical and kind of ambiguous and poetic and often beautiful, but they suited the audience to which they were written, not the sources from which they were drawn. So yes, there is often a range of possible translations of a specific sentence or a specific paragraph in a Sanskrit work, but that range is much narrower than yogis often suppose. Because authors generally know what they mean to say when they set pen to paper, just as when any educated blogger sets fingers to keyboard, he knows what he means to say, whether or not he says it very well or not. In the same way, any Sanskrit author knows what he means to say, and the job of the reader is to ascertain what he means to say, and also, if he's interested in cultural studies, what's in the background, meaning to say what informs this author's thinking. But at any rate, that's why I say there is usually a correct translation. Sometimes we cannot be sure what the author intended. And authorial intent is a very important issue when you're presuming that the author in question was some kind of enlightened being, or at least had tremendous insight beyond the norm for a human being. So if you're presuming that, authorial intent does matter. And that's what we try to discern in this science of what's called philology. That is the interpretation of what texts mean and attempting to get as close as possible to the original author's thought. And that's what I'm passionately interested in. And I can't say I always get it right, but to cleave ever closer to the mind of Abhinavagupta or his successor Kshemarajya is a thrilling exercise. It's like my version of, skydiving or something, because these minds were absolutely luminous. I've never read anything like it in English, or very, very rarely. and just to like comprehend what they're trying to express in this beautifully ornate language of Sanskrit is really the most fulfilling thing I can imagine doing with my time.
Well, that certainly comes across in your writings. And another thing that I really appreciate about, because I spent some time on your site just recently getting ready to talk to you, was that it's always really clear where there's a translation and then it says my comment, like when it's commentary.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes that's the difference, is like the actual translations, even in when they're translated, they still remain in a more poetic language. It's almost like reading Shakespearean sonnets or something to learn about love. Like you can totally
Yes.
do that, but it is going to require some explication,
Right.
And so it seems to me that to be clear about when it's like you're literally trying to make a translation and when you're adding your commentary on what you believe that's saying is sometimes where it gets murky. And I know you've kind of called people out on that some.
Exactly, and what's interesting is that the commentary, the translator's commentary, must be separated from the translation, and yet it's a part of the translation because the translator knows a heck of a lot more if he actually can read Sanskrit and is familiar with the literature. He knows a heck of a lot more, or she knows a heck of a lot more, and there are some women Sanskritists these days, thank God, about the context of the work in question than the reader knows. So in order to ascertain what the author means to express, the translator often has to give a little bit of that context, which was obvious to the readers in the author's own time. And one of my professors taught me to ask the crucial question: what does this author believe is so obvious to his audience that he needn't bother say it?
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that readers today don't often ask themselves when they're reading a text from another era. They don't ask themselves, well, what context to this author was so obvious that he needn't bother say it, but by that very token is so important.
And there was certainly a context there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Because all of these incredible spiritual texts, they are what we call, as scholars, intertextual, meaning they pay homage to earlier revelations, if you will, and they allude to esoteric practices, and they see themselves as part of a complex body of work. They don't see themselves in isolation, and there's absolutely no vision in this culture at this time of the independent artist expressing his individual experience that seems so important to Americans. That whole ethic is just completely absent. It's of a collective enterprise of truth-seeking and meaning-making, and each author sees themselves as embedded in a web of interrelationships. So context is even more important than it is for reading American literature or poetry.
Well, now I want to talk a little bit about Abhinavagupta, because when I met that Swami, the big switch, like the overall switch, was that I showed up with this very abstract idea in my head that if I followed these 8 steps, I could accomplish some consciousness that would make me beyond suffering or something like that. It wasn't fully formed. And he sort of flipped it around to this very different idea. He would say, oh, you need to do a little something, you do a little something. It was more about just being able to be in life and have joy in that. And, when I got back and I got those translations of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, I also did end up finding my way to an article by Georg Feuerstein, who is also, I guess, one of the earlier scholar practitioners.
Sure, yeah.
And it was called Archaic Yoga. And it was specifically about the yoga before Patanjali. And he was dating it back to like earlier Stone Age shamanism.
Yeah.
And he draws this really sharp distinction between what he saw happening, or what he took from the early Vedic hymns, and what Patanjali was talking about. He talks about the difference between people going inwards and having inspired inner vision of like some sort of cosmic order, and then manifesting that in their attitudes and actions. as opposed to like this liberation of this individual self, or this almost like extinction of what we would consider, I'm quoting, atypically human. And so that's become, to me, it seems like such a fundamental thing, which I've heard you talk about, is the difference between non-dualism and dualism. And I'm just wondering, like, I've also heard people translate Patanjali's Yoga Sutras in like a non-dual way. So my question is, do you think that Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are inherently dualistic and then someone's putting a non-dual lens on top of that? Or can it be interpreted both ways?
Well, this is such an important question. And we have to look at it from two different angles, historical and spiritual. Historically, Sanskrit scholars have a total consensus. There's no dispute at all about the fact that Patanjali is explicitly and avowedly dualistic. And that Patanjali's yoga, in some sense, we could say, if we exaggerate it a bit, is about escaping the human condition. And Patanjali's word for liberation, spiritual liberation, is specifically kaivalya, which literally means isolation or separation. And he means separation from the ordinary human condition of suffering, separation from all attachments, separation from body identification, and ultimately separation from the body itself and the conditions of embodiment which cause suffering. So in that sense, it's what we call a transcendentalist philosophy or spiritual path. It seeks an up and out trajectory, to get free of this veil of tears, as it were. And that's abundantly clear in Patanjali and in the early commentaries on Patanjali. And the reason it's not clear to yogis today is because the influence of Tantra was so great that after about the year 1200, nobody wrote commentaries on Patanjali from a sympathetic point of view. And for the evidence of this, if you want, you can see David White's new book, The Biography of the Yoga Sutra, the story of the Yoga Sutra across time, which has a lot of good points to make. And he points out, nobody wrote a sympathetic commentary supporting Patanjali's view after about 12 or 1300. And that certainly includes our modern authors like Iyengar, who have essentially written a Tantra-influenced commentary and translate the sutras in accordance with that view, even if it means mistranslating them. And this actually started, in the modern period with Vivekananda over 100 years ago, who also gave a non-dualist spin to Patanjali. Now we can say this is certainly not what Patanjali meant, but then there's this other important question: is it not spiritually more efficacious? If the answer is yes, and I think it often is, depending on the translator, then you see it's true in a different sense. It's not true in the sense that it doesn't accord with Patanjali's intention, as is abundantly clear in the Sanskrit, but it's true in the sense that it offers an interpretation of this originally dualistic text that's actually, I think, more in line with the nature of reality and more beneficial to human beings, at least in our era, if not in others as well. So that nuances the question. You see, it's not a simple black and white of this translation's wrong or whatever.
I got that. Well, that makes a lot of sense to me, because in the schools, and I've studied, in Desikachar, Krishnamacharya tradition, they do translations or commentary on the sutras that are very non-dual and in sense. And I've often questioned them because I've kind of fancy myself more radical about my non-duality, and there's always some qualifications on it. And it seems like there would have to be some kind of qualifications on it if Patanjali is your source text.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
You can spin it towards the non-dual, but you never entirely get there. And that's the problem I have with Iyengar's translation, is it's this muddle in the middle. It's sort of non-dual and then it's sort of not. So you get these conservative Brahminical values of renunciation mixed in with non-dualistic tantric ideas of oneness, and the liberation of consciousness that implies, but they don't actually cohere effectively. You can't have at the same time conservative Brahminical values that emphasize hierarchy and tantric values that emphasize the beauty of self-expression in whatever way consciousness chooses to move through that individual. So in tantric values are more aligned with our values in modern culture of egalitarianism. Well, not everyone's values, right?
Yeah.
Values most yogis hold. Egalitarianism, freedom of expression, non-discrimination against people on the basis of class, sexual preference, and so on. All of that is a part of Tantra and not a part of conservative Brahminical values. And in all of these translations, not only Iyengar, but Sachidananda in the 60s and others, we see this mixture of these two actually incompatible, or at least partially incompatible systems. And by the way, just to mention briefly, I'm actually very soon going to start a project, and I'm just mentioning it because it's relevant, of releasing videos where for each Yoga Sutra, I give the original meaning vis-a-vis Patanjali and his early commentators, and then give what a tantric reinterpretation of that sutra would be, but marked as separate, as distinct interpretations, so that we don't have this muddle,
Well, I appreciate that, but I also appreciate what you said in terms of like, it's not that one's true and one's not, because if someone utilizes that text in a certain way and makes it true for them in a certain way, we can't say that that's not true.
Well, exactly. And when I do these videos where I give classical and tantric interpretations of each sutra, I'm not going to say one's right or one's wrong. I'll leave it to the viewer to decide for themselves, because indeed, sometimes a classical approach can serve a person. For example, if you're a yogi seeking to become free of addiction, then classical yoga of renunciation might be of greater service than the tantric view that regards everything as an expression of the divine.
Well, that brings me to something. Before we talk about whether everything being an expression of divine and how that makes it hard for people who are in recovery, I first want to go back to something you said, because I think it's an important question to me personally, which is this idea of if Tantra is is it a self-determined thing, or is it like a more prescribed path? Because I know there's Tantric, there's lineage and there's texts, and then there's more general ideas of what Tantra teaches. And is it fair to say that as if it's a Tantra, that means that you determine it?
No, definitely not. Because the traditional view is that if you already knew how to free yourself of delusion and suffering, you would have done so. And therefore, you give yourself over to a lineage and to a compassionate and effective teacher, not to abdicate your authority, but to obtain guidance. And if the teacher is effective, he or she makes you increasingly independent of the teacher, meaning the effective teacher in this model is always trying to put themselves out of a job.
Right.
But the student does need a teacher at a critical phase, the early phases of the path, and then the teacher continuously empowers and educates the student until they are able to access their inner intuition, this intuitive faculty that the tradition calls pratibha, which is thought to be something much deeper than the mind. And it's difficult to talk about in words, intuitive faculty that is sometimes called the inner guru. So the tradition says the function of the outer guru, and guru just means teacher here, not lofty person to put on a pedestal, but the function of the outer guru is to lead you to the inner guru as quickly as possible, to make you not dependent on the teacher as quickly as possible.
See, I guess that's I think that's what I meant, that this inner guru that you're talking about, like that's what you'd be pointing a student to. But that from there, they take the reins. It's not like the teacher's prescribing the path that they're supposed to take.
Right. But, you know, the ideal, and Americans, I think, balk at this, the ideal in the tradition is that the student's humble enough to say, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. I don't know how to be free of suffering. I've tortured myself. My mind's all full of these. Help me.
Yeah.
I'll do what you say, as Arjuna says in the Bhagavad Gita to Krishna. You know, I will do your bidding, and that's where, of course, it matters that the teacher really has the student's interests at heart, not their own, right. And that's why the tradition says test your teacher for a year before you fully commit.
Oh,
you know,
that's what it says. Test your teacher for a year before you commit.
Yes, critically look at, are the other students of this teacher, are they getting more and more independent and more self-confident, self-dependent, or are they transferring all their authority to the teacher? And such other critical reflections that you engage in, and you feel, if you feel good about the community and the teacher, and you commit, and then you trust, and in that act of trust, there's a tremendous relief. Because you don't have to do it all your own. You have community, you have peers, you have a teacher who you find effective, and it may only be for a few years. You know, that it's not like you're creating a new ego identity on the basis of this community. You're just taking the support of a powerful and effective guide until your everything clarifies to the extent that your mind is sufficiently quiet and your inner sense is sufficiently clear that you feel this deep inner pull that we call by the name pratibha in Sanskrit, that it's the kind of golden thread that leads you along your individual path. Because even though the path is universal, everyone's version of it is individual, you know, and we don't all do the things in the same order or express it the same way. We all have individual versions of a universal path. So ultimately you have to follow your own golden thread that leads you from one insight or realization to another practice, to another opportunity, to, you know, and I'm just summing it up in a very clumsy way, but ultimately it is individual and it is self-determined, and you are your own authority, but you need the teacher to help access a place beyond your conditioned mind.
Right. Right. We always say you can't see your own butt, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that's coming to mind now that I would love to hear you speak is that this idea that you just spoke about, awareness that one might come to and the process of coming to that. But you've also spoken about like the need for that to be integrated, that it isn't actually just enough to come to some kind of understanding about things, or, you know, even in terms of like higher consciousness, but that it actually has to be integrated into a life.
Well, this is the tantric model, and this is what makes it different from other forms of yoga, is that most forms, you know, pre-tantric forms of yoga teach transcendence. And tantric yoga teaches transcendence followed by permeation or pervasion, meaning you transcend the ordinary human condition, and you don't transcend up to some higher state of godlike or alien consciousness. You actually transcend inward to the core of your being, to that within you which is unborn and undying. And transcending inward to the core of your being, beyond mind, personality, ego, memories, all of that stuff. Then bringing what you discover at the core of your being into embodiment, into all the layers of your being. So it's actually this twofold movement where you sort of, repeatedly plunge inward to the absolute center, and then bring whatever you find there outward and infuse it into all the layers of embodiment, including your everyday life and your everyday relationships. And that's exactly what makes it tantric yoga, is that it's this twofold movement. And so this infusion or permeation or pervasion, we could also just call integration. That's that second step. And you do both steps repeatedly. You keep seeking your center as best you can, and then you keep seeking to bring whatever you find at the center of your being into all the aspects of your life. And without that integration, the tantrics, I think, rightly argued, you can have these really sublime mystical experiences, and if you don't integrate them, you're not of benefit to other beings.
Well, that makes sense to me because, I had a period of time in my life where I would do these lengthy seated meditations, and they would often be quite wonderful. I felt that I went to many wonderful places in myself, but at the time, there was all kinds of trouble in my life, and I was very lonely, and I didn't have good relationships, and in a way, having those meditations kind of made my life worse. Everything would be fantastic in these seated meditations, but then when I would leave my meditation, everything was kind of shitty. And so at a certain point, it just felt like, well, whatever it is that I'm discovering in these seated meditations, they have to find a way out into my relationships in my life. Otherwise, it's not helping.
Exactly. In fact, the contrast can become very painful if you're not integrating. And most people don't instinctively integrate.
Yeah.
We have rare examples like Eckhart Tolle, who just sat around on a park bench for a year, and he integrated his awakening without any help somehow. He was a lucky bastard,
Well, it's funny you say that because I talked to Neil Pearson, who's a pain science guy, and he mentioned a similar thing, how there are certain times where people will have these kind of magical healings, and it happens, but it's not something you want to count on,
Yeah, for the most part, integration has to be, there has to be intention and will and effort to integrate. Sometimes it's harder, sometimes it's easier, depending on what samskaras and what karma that person is carrying. But it can be as easy as asking, well, what would it look like if I allowed what I experienced in deep meditation to express in everyday life? What might that look like? Let me just invite that contemplation. Let me just start moving things in that direction. And however many times I stumble and fall in that process, I'm in the process. That's the important thing.
Cool. Well, now I kind of want to talk a little bit about Abhinavagupta because I've just been so curious about him. And, when I saw that post on Facebook, you mentioned that you were going to put out a translation, and I just kept thinking, oh, it's going to come out. And I know it's supposed to come out in 2017, maybe. And I didn't even know that throughout last year, you put out a bunch of stuff in blog posts.
Yeah.
And so I didn't know we were going to talk. And Piper, your person, she contacted me a couple of days ago, and I've been on your site for the last 2 days, but it's so dense. I've been absorbing as much as I can. But maybe you could say a little bit about him and why does nobody know about him?
Well, a lot of people know about him, but it's a very small number compared to the general population.
I mean, he seems really relevant, in terms of, like you said, there's so much Tantra influence on everything. And he seems like the man when it comes to this.
Yes. Well, he is in many, what we could compare him to. He holds a similar place in tantric philosophy that Kant and Hegel do in European philosophy. Although if I was going to compare Western philosophers to Abhinavagupta, I would have to take elements of Kant, elements of Hegel, and elements of Heidegger. And as any philosophy student knows, these are three of the absolute giants of Western philosophy. And so is Abhinavagupta. He is just this amazing, stunning intellect. And what's all the more kind of amazing is that he took no pride in his intellect. In fact, one of his big teachings was to use mental conceptualizations in such a way as to allow yourself to transcend mental conceptualization. And he argued that the most sublime and divine experience of reality is to experience the world directly without conceptual overlay. Whatever that overlay might be. Oh, this is such and such a type of person here that I'm meeting, or this is a tree and this is a dog, or whatever. Instead of each moment, an irreducibly unique experience, a revelation of divine consciousness in form that is filled with wonder. So he was this ecstatic being. He loved the word chamatkara, which means astonishment or wonder or awe, because that's how he experienced the world. He teaches that when you remove conceptual overlay from your raw experience, then your raw experience is a succession of wondrous moments, Not every moment is wondrous, but so many are. When you've removed that mentally generated idea that you think you know what things are because you can put them into some category or another, which also prevents us from encountering people's fundamental humanity, because we see, white person, black person, gay person, straight person, Republican, Democrat, all that stuff. And he said, without all that conceptual overlay, each person is a revelation of the divine. You may not like them. It might be the divine in a disguise you don't enjoy necessarily, but you're more likely to encounter what's beautiful in them if you're not projecting the categories onto them through which it's easy to interpret them. So this is a brief summary of what one thing that's astonishing about Abhinavagupta, this towering intellect who himself undermines the importance of intellect and does so in an incredibly clever way. It's like he exemplifies what he teaches. He uses his intellect to help the reader get beyond their attachment to their intellect. And by intellect, I mean not just the thinking part, but the faculty of judgment, right? He understood intellect to mean that which judges and says, this is good, this is bad, and you're right and you're wrong. All that kind of judgment and discrimination in the negative sense of the word, that's the function of intellect that he invites us to go beyond, to become more intimate with the raw human experience, which is so much more joyful. So that's one thing that's amazing about him.
Well, I know also, just to jump in, it makes me think when I was reading that, it was interesting to me that he wrote the Tantra Loka in this totally for all the heavy headers, philosophically, and then he rewrote it so other people could understand it.
Exactly. And, that's what I'm more interested in publishing. I've translated and released a little bit of the Tantra Loka, but I've translated more of, and I'm definitely going to publish the Tantra Sada, which means the essence of Tantra. And that work is his attempt to simplify the teachings of the Tantra Loka for a less philosophically educated audience. Still a thoughtful and reflective audience, but one that isn't necessarily trained in the rules of logical argumentation and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So the Tantra Sada is an amazing work.
Would you say that it was meant to be more in a language that people could grasp if they're not coming from those circles?
Well, yes. He never wrote for someone who was uneducated, because they wouldn't even be able to read it all in that society.
Right.
But the Tantra Sara is it's a powerful spiritual transmission that cuts away all the logical argumentation, because just like in Western philosophy, Indian philosophy, a lot of Westerners don't even know this. Proper Indian philosophy includes rigorous logical argumentation, and that is found interspersed with mystical poetry and other modes of writing in the Tantra Loka. But in the Tantra Sada, he dispenses with not entirely, but mostly he dispenses with the logical argumentation and gives these powerful kind of revelatory sutras and transmissions from his, what I would call awakened consciousness. If anyone ever deserved to be called awakened, it was this guy. But he actually wrote several dozen works, 3/4 of which survive to the present day. And I'm working on a few of those. I did a blog post you can look at on the essence of ultimate reality, or the Paramartha Sada. That's another work by this genius figure,
Mm-hmm.
And then I quote a whole bunch of his verses here and there in my book, Tantra Illuminated, as well. But ultimately, yes, more. I want to get more publications out there, and Tantra Sara is certainly it's certainly coming in the
Cool.
next 2 years, I would say.
Well, I look forward to it. And, the other thing that I wanted to ask about that I read that really jumped out to me is that there is this thing where, like you said, I've had some experience that sounds like that, where when I'm able to let go of like this broader effort I make in like this real world, like my version of your Christopher world, right? Okay, so when I'm able to let go of that world more, I do feel a sense of wonder, and that helps me then with that other thing. But it also, I read that Gupta said that not everyone's really ready to have everything stripped away and be in like a non-dual state of mind, and that's why there's duality, and that you have to actually there's stages, and not everyone's at the same stage. Maybe is that right?
Sure. There's no normativity in this discourse, meaning to say there's no implication that if you don't undertake this spiritual process of attaining non-duality, then you're somehow less than human or less than perfectly human. In fact, the view here is that everyone is expressing various aspects of divine consciousness. And there's a doctrine of concealment and revelation that people who choose to hurt other people, they're equally divine to anyone else, but their divinity is more effectively concealed. There's that notion, but there's never the notion that things should be other than as they are, including the natural human desire to make change. You see, it's not that people always get triggered by this teaching. Things are not other than as they should be, because then they imagine a static reality, like what the world's like right now forever, which is of course insane, right? Because what is the most salient aspect of our reality is change. So when the tradition says things shouldn't be other than as they are, it specifically includes that human impulse to make change, that we follow that impulse, and that's part of the beauty and of the pattern of being, the pattern of life. So yes, in other words, no normativity in the discourse means if you experience duality as real, and to you non-duality is just poppycock imaginative bullshit, fine. Pursue that experience to the furthest extent it can take you. Pursue a dualistic relationship to God as something other as far as it can take you. And us versus them mentality. See where that takes you, the tradition says. And then, sooner or later, you see its limitations. And you see that that duality exists within a context of a greater context of unity. However much we might try to separate ourselves from our environment, we can't do it. We're utterly dependent on our environment, and we'll learn that lesson or we'll die. Either way, it's fine from the perspective of divine consciousness, because the experiment of consciousness will continue in some form, somewhere, no matter what. So the point is that duality, it's like, do what seems right to you, but do it fully. Take it to the furthest extent, to its logical conclusion, until you see that if it doesn't work, and if it doesn't, then you open to a greater possibility.
Well, I feel a lot of joy when I hear you say that. It feels like truth to me. And I thank you for it. And I also I kind of want to make a turn a little bit, because it makes me think of, recently, I was on this like Hindu Facebook group, and I get into skirmishes sometimes, not really, but I'm interested in what they say. And I had someone from the Facebook group on the podcast, and we talked all about like decolonizing language and culture, and letting Hindus define what Hinduism is. They really assert they're not making a distinction between like the early wisdom culture Dharma and Hinduism. They want to say that yoga is Hinduism. And I was taught differently than that and challenged them on that and went back and forth. And ultimately in the end, I was really trying to just be open, like, and examining my own white male privilege, honestly. And I also then, after I put it out, I got emails from people who are like, hey, I think you're ignoring like the politics in India, man. And and what's going on there and where some of this is coming from. And so I kind of suspicion that you're probably someone who knows a little bit about this and might be able to say something about that, because I feel like I kind of had a blinder there.
Well, I can say a little bit about it. I can't say too much, honestly, out of risk to myself, because some of these people are what we would call fundamentalists. Of course, they deny that label. But if you challenge their beliefs enough, it can even escalate to threats of violence and death threats. And I know other scholars who have received death threats. It's not a laughing matter. But in brief, I would say the spiritual principle here is that, which is from the Indian culture itself, you become whatever you passionately focus on, even if the emotion of the focus is hatred. And there's these wonderful examples from the Ramayana and Mahabharata where somebody hated Krishna or hated Rama so passionately that when they died, they became perfectly one with Krishna because their total focus was on Krishna. But it cuts the other way too. If you hate evil, or what we consider evil, strongly enough, you eventually feel justified in using the same tactics that the side you regard as evil are using against them. And this is exactly what we've seen in the modern world. This very spiritual teaching of the ancient tradition played out on a massive stage where the US can justify absolutely clearly terrorist tactics, torture and so on, against terrorists. I mean, it can't justify it, but it thinks it can, which to me is simply the definition of insanity. And by the same token, we've seen how, an incredibly oppressed, persecuted, and people, victims of genocide, the nation of Israel, doing not as bad, but something along the same lines to the Palestinians. I know that's a controversial comment, but I think anyone who looks at it objectively can see the at least partial truth to that comment, the way the Palestinians are being treated, And then by the same token, then the irony is that some of these members of the Hindu right or Hindutva or the RSS or the BJP, they're actually being hegemonic and oppressive in their views, and this is how specifically, and this is factually verifiable. Simply this: they say yoga is Hindu. Yoga is part of Hinduism, and you better give credit, or else you're culturally appropriating. The only thing is, it's a downright lie, because yoga has always been part of Buddhism. Yoga has always been part of Jainism, and yoga has always been also practiced as an atheistic discipline in ancient India. Maybe not anymore, but it was. And therefore, unless you define Hinduism as including Buddhism and Jainism, which, by the way, some Hindu fundamentalists actually do, then you've got no call saying yoga is Hindu, because it's just as much Buddhist, it's just as much Jain, and those traditions are as old as anything that you could possibly call Hindu. So I utterly repudiate that claim, which is historically uninformed and hegemonic and oppressive.
Well, hopefully that doesn't get you any hate mail.
Maybe one or two.
But you seem to be able to handle yourself.
Yeah.
Well, that pretty much covers what I really wanted to talk about, and I really appreciate it. I feel like
Well, and just sorry, Jay.
Yeah, go ahead. If there's anything we haven't talked about that you want to talk about, I mean, there's a lot of yoga teachers who listen to this and stuff.
On that very thing.
Sure.
On that very thing. The last point is that therefore, I think it's important that we're sensitive to issues of cultural appropriation. And at the same time, yoga was always, from its beginnings, interreligious, meaning practiced by people of multiple different religions, avowedly different religions, and atheists as well. And so therefore, it is absolutely not against the spirit of yoga in any way for somebody of a different religion today, a Christian or a Jew or somebody else, to practice yoga. I think to do so respectfully, they have to inform themselves about the roots and the sources, because indeed these distinct Indian religions like Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism have a common cultural matrix that allows for greater interreligious understanding. So I think informing and educating ourselves is important, but yoga has always been interreligious, and so, you know, in that sense, the cultural appropriation argument can go too far.
Mm-hmm.
But I
agree.
think it does have some value, and I've addressed that here and there in my writing.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I mean, that I do really like a lot that we talked about in that conversation, in the sense that, you know, even if I have made it what it needs to be for me, still it has roots, and we should be able to point students to those roots. So that brings me to where I was before, which is I really just, one of the things I'm hoping to try to do is, you know, raise the level of conversation. And I feel like you really helped me do that. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, no problem.
And
maybe we can talk again sometime, because any of these topics and others we haven't even touched on, there's plenty more to say, you know?
Well, that would be great. I'm really happy to come on and we can just like pick one topic and go more deep in it.
Yeah. And just for your listeners, I just mentioned, for anyone who is really interested in this Abhinavagupta character we were talking about, I do have some blog posts introducing him and talking about him, and almost all my content is free on tantricstudies.org. That's tantric with a K, not a C, to distinguish it from American neo-tantric sex. tantricstudies.org with a K. And
well, so maybe that's the next. Maybe that's the next conversation, right?
Yeah. I did talk. I did talk to a fellow named Ashton Sabo. I forget what his podcast is called, but for anyone who wants to understand the why Tantra doesn't really have almost anything to do with American tantric sex, they can listen to that podcast. If you don't mind me mentioning someone else, he's a great guy.
No, I don't mind that at all. I'm happy to give props to the other podcast. I didn't bring it up because I felt like it was low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
So cool. So tantricstudies.org, you said?
Yeah.
Cool. And is there any particular projects you got out there you want to promote or tell people about? I know you got some courses and things that you offer, or any ongoing places they can study with you or anything like that?
Well, there's always new courses coming up, and I'm always embarrassed at the whole thing of self-promotion, and it's not really in my nature. But I want to say that I work hard to offer the best that I have, and nobody who's taken my courses has ever complained or been disappointed or asked for a refund ever. In fact, they almost always say, wow, I got way more than I thought I would. So I do invite people who are interested to check out these courses, which are mentioned on tantricstudies.org, whether it's retreats or online courses. There's all kinds of stuff. And I've got a book coming out at the end of the year, and, it's all there to explore. So I don't necessarily want to push any one particular thing, but I did already mention that project for the, Yoga Sutras, doing 1 10-minute video per sutra, because it's cool, because the YouTube format fits the sutra format. Because a sutra is one sentence, and you can cover it in 1 10-minute YouTube video,
There you go. Integration, you see?
Yeah.
Well, listen, you don't want to toot your horn, so I'll just toot it for a second, because I've been on your site looking at the Gupta stuff you've been posting, and I just think it's invaluable. Again, it's something I always want to know about, and like, you're the only person I know doing it, so thank you so much. It's a real service.
Thank you, Jay. It's really great to talk to you. And I want to say, actually, I really appreciate your interviewing style. It's really supportive and inquisitive and real. And I just really enjoy it. Seriously.
Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate that. It means a lot.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga, guided meditation, and much, much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Grazia Tribulato. New episodes drop every week, and may all beings benefit.